Sup, creeps, and welcome to Creepy Confidential. Is Mothman really a supernatural force predicting impending doom? Did Apollo 11 really land on the moon in 1969? Did you find out if that was a cult that was living just 2 doors down that you waved to every single day when you got your mail? If these are the things you ponder when you should be sleeping, then I would like to welcome you to Creepy Confidential. I'm your host, Noelle, your resident weirdo Wisconsinite. I open case files on my favorite cryptids, cults, conspiracies, and other worldly creepy, with new cases, live broadcasts, and local lore. Some stories have been lost with time. Others are perhaps still happening today in your local communities, right up under your very creepy noses. So get ready, creeps. It's Creepy Confidential. Sup, creeps, and welcome back. Today we're exploring a creature that refuses to die. That's right, we're sinking our teeth into the evolution of vampires in cinema with some of my favorite films. From shadowy figures creeping out of silent films to romantic antiheroes lighting up billion-dollar franchises, vampires have transformed more than almost any other monster in movie history. Before I get going, today's episode will have spoilers. I will be talking about plot points on films that may give away the twists and end of the movie. You have been warned. All right, creeps, grab your garlic, sharpen your steaks. Let's dive into the dark. Let us start with the birth of the cinematic vampire. To understand the vampire's cinematic journey, we've got to start at the beginning. The first major vampire to appear on film was in 1922's Nosferatu. This wasn't your sleek, sexy vampire. Oh no. Count Orlok was grotesque. Long fingers, rat-like teeth, and a bald head that made him look more like a walking plague than a seductive aristocrat. What's fascinating, and that many of you may know, is that Nosferatu was an unauthorized adaptation of Bram Stoker's Dracula. The filmmakers couldn't secure the rights, so they changed names, but the story was essentially the same. Stoker's widow sued, and nearly every copy of the film was destroyed. Luckily, a few survived, and Nosferatu became a cornerstone of horror cinema. Vampires represented pestilence, disease, and death. In post-World War I Europe, with the Spanish flu still fresh in memory, the image resonated deeply. Fast forward to 1931, and we get Universal Studios' Dracula. This was the first Dracula movie I remember watching, and of course, the Hammer films later, but I don't want to get too ahead of myself. But Bela Lugosi's performance as the Count Dracula cemented the vampire archetype for decades. Unlike Count Orlok, Lugosi's Dracula was suave, elegant, and hypnotic. His accent, his cape, and that intense stare turned Dracula into not just a monster, but a strangely alluring figure. This was where the vampire myth started to pivot, from monstrous and grotesque to something more complex, dangerous, but irresistible. The film was a huge success, and it launched Hollywood's love affair with Gothic horror with a certain allure to it. The 1930s to the 1950s saw countless sequels, spin-offs, and Universal monster mashups. But vampires became part of pop culture's monster squad. But as decades rolled on, the image of the vampire kept changing, reflecting the fears and desires of the times. The next major shift was the introduction of the Hammer horror era. By the late 1950s, Britain's Hammer Film Productions gave vampires a major upgrade and another shift in the presentation of Dracula. This is when our beloved Christopher Lee entered and stepped into the role with 1958's horror of Dracula. Not only can this man do metal music and Count Dooku, Lee's Dracula brought a whole new flavor. He was tall, brooding, physically commanding, and in my opinion, vicious. Gone was the silent, stiff aristocrat. This Dracula had bloodshot eyes, dripping fangs, and a predatory sexuality that both terrified and thrilled audiences. The Hammer films leaned heavy into color and gore. Bright red blood splattering across the Victorian settings. They were lurid, violent, and scandalous, and they were a hit. This era solidified the vampire as a symbol of erotic danger. The bite was no longer just an attack, it was a seduction. And that theme carried forward into almost every cinematic vampire that followed. Now grab a pen and paper, creeps, because I'm about to dive into must-see movie titles. Even if they aren't what you expect for a 2025 movie, the Hammer films are a staple in the horror movie academy. The 60s were a crazy time everywhere, but horror specifically was cracking open, with Christopher Lee leading by continuing his 1958 Dracula premiere with Brides of Dracula in 1960, Dracula, Prince of Darkness in 1966, and Dracula Has Risen from His Grave in 1968. The 1970s and 80s brought a huge vampire boom. On one side, you had serious reimaginings like Werner Herzog's Nosferatu, The Vampire in 1979, which paid tribute to the original. On the other hand, you had camp, like that campy films like Blackzilla in 1972, which folded vampire lore into, at the time, what was happening, blaxploitation cinema. The Hammer Dracula films still reigned supreme, including Taste the Blood of Dracula in 1970 and Scars of Dracula also in 1970. These films featured Christopher Lee in the title role for most of the series installments, with the later films like Dracula AD and then also the Satanic Rites of Dracula shifting to a more modern, for that time, and contemporary setting. To me, this was when I remember thinking it was strange that evil could change into a wolf, but others could not. It was another morph in the vampire lore that is best put by another vampire that will show up later, but that quote says, "The dark gift is different for us all." Now, if you already recognize that quote, you're in friendly company, but moving on through this decade. Now, who could forget The Lost Boys from 1987? Leather jackets, motorcycles, and a gang of teenage vampires that felt more like a rock band than monsters. This film fused the vampire myth with youth rebellion, and suddenly vampires were cool. It also brought forth the lowering of the age of the film vampire and one of the macho lead roles. Even when you get to the twist, and again, it shows one never knows who you think you know when it comes to The Lost Boys. Now, next, still in the 80s, is Fright Night 2 from 1988. And this time, the lead was a gorgeous, exotic female. Regine was Jerry's sister from the first Fright Night, and she's back for revenge for killing her brother. The 80s had a way of making things, a little sexier, I'll say. They really went crazy with the makeup, the hair, the wardrobe, and it almost made vampires also look like a poisonous snake or like an amphibian, meaning that the more elaborate they were or the colors they had, it meant that they were more vicious or poisonous. The theme of the vampire morphing into a wolf shows up in this one as well, with one of Regine's henchmen that could, when he would hunt, he would turn into this like wolf-like It's almost like a wolf-like state, but so that it appears once more. These later vampire movies also show the vampire drinking and draining their prey, where before it was implied just how much they needed, maybe not all of it. This upped the ante. One had no chance of survival. But if Frigine was preying on me, would I really resist? By the 1990s, vampires had fully embraced their role as tragic, tortured figures. The biggest influence here? Anne Rice. Her Vampire Chronicle novels, especially Interview with the Vampire, redefined the vampire as a creature of immense beauty, power, and existential angst. When everyone met Lestat and Louis for the first times, our brains exploded. When the film adaptation Interview with the Vampire arrived in 1994, starring Tom Cruise and Brad Pitt, it dripped with gothic grandeur. These vampires weren't villains, they were protagonists wrestling with immorality, morality, and desire. Lestat wanted a companion, and he preyed upon the desperate with famed line, "I'm going to give you the choice I never had," to which he drained Louis to the brink of death and then gave him the choice: die now and meet your maker or live at my side. The movie showed the handful of types of vampires. Lestat was cruel and vicious because he never had happiness or content. Louis refused to give in to his vampiric needs, and when he did, we got Claudia, a child vampire, the most deadly of the trio, the most hungry. And yet, because she could not age, she had this fury inside of her like none other. Then you have the vampires overseas living in the catacombs. Vampire pretending to be human, pretending to be vampire as an actor's troupe. We saw them bring a victim on stage, strip her of her garments, and as she runs to Armand's arms, hoping for help, she is offered up as a meal. And no one knows the wiser. They think it's completely an act. Ghastly. That same decade gave us Bram Stoker's Dracula from 1992, directed by Francis Ford Coppola, my favorite movie, I think my favorite horror movie. This is a masterpiece. Gary Oldman's Dracula was equal parts terrifying and sympathetic, a love story spanning centuries. We meet him as this pale recluse, and as the story progresses, we see him take the form of a young, handsome man, and then a wolf-like creature as he preys on Lucy, an oversized bat at one point, and then even morphs into a mountain of rats. This version of Dracula displays his origin story also in full light, very close to Vlad the Impaler without straight up calling him Vlad the Impaler, but still calling him that name. In a sense, the love of his life commits suicide on false pretenses that he has perished in battle. And then he arrives home to discover this, and he curses his holy faith and God, cursing his body and being cursed to be blood-drinking, immortal forever. Not vampire related, but you have to ignore Keanu Reeves' horrible English accent in this movie. Just squint your ears a little. When I say it's a masterpiece, that's kind of the one part that's kind of on the side I feel like I need to mention. The rest, especially the Brides of Dracula, oh my God, chef's kiss. Absolutely wonderful. The world also gets Blade, From Dusk Till Dawn, John Carpenter's Vampires, Buffy the Vampire Slayer, the movie, and Vampire in Brooklyn. These are all homework, by the way, and there will be a quiz at a future date. But Blade held the classic idea of vampires, but now the vampire was the anti-hero in this very epic good against evil vampire flick. This time, vampires weren't just existing in the dark and slithering from room to room. This daywalker could show up and kick ass no matter the time of day. It introduced the idea that vampires could take something to suppress, changing fully into a bloodthirsty vampire. This movie is essentially a memory for us, kind of has that essential memory because of, I'll say, just 2 words: blood rave. Enter the 2000s and a whole new audience, a whole new millennia, and an entire shift in vampire evolution once more. Between the year 2000 and now, there are many vampire movies that show a shift in the ideas and backgrounds. So let's just kind of hit the heavy hitters, and then I'll say my favorites. I'll be staying in the cinema world though, so I'll be leaving out, those masterpieces like True Blood. That was a TV show. I also won't be coming back around for sequels, unless there's something that really shows up, like I mentioned before in Fright Night, how it changed from a male to a female, which we had never seen before. And then lastly, before the train leaves the station for the next part, I'm just talking about movie versions right now. I know many are getting their undergarments in a kerfluffle about things mentioned and not mentioned, but thought I'd try to prevent that. So, moving on. Kicking off 2000 with Dracula 2000. Not only does this flick contain the beloved Gerard Butler as the lead vampire role, but it kicks off with a turn kind of on that sexy dial a la Y2K style. But it also, on the other side, shows a backstory that takes us back to the days of Jesus and putting the Dracula origin as Judas, which is a kind of another turn instead of Vlad the Impaler when he curses his religion. Now he is Judas. This story shows Judas taking the bribe, Jesus being crucified, and hanging himself, out of guilt, but is revived and is now the first vampire. And that's where the first vampire starts, right? This idea is of Dracula existing and blaming Jesus for his eternal damnation. This one sticks out because it was a Y2K version of the original Dracula story, in a sense where Mary and Lucy, instead of Mina and Lucy. So you had those two. The brides are now replaced with 3 kind of sex pot chicks that from that time period, right, that Drac has acquired. And then Van Helsing still exists, but he's been holding Dracula's body hostage and sampling the goods to keep himself alive over time. And creators have now injected a very heavy religious story to his line. So even in this film, although somewhat cheesy, the very story of the original Dracula changes to make it more modern, but also now they're taking a chance because they're making it more religious. 2002 brought us another book rendition of an Anne Rice book. This time, The Queen of the Damned was brought to life with a modern cast, but a taste of what the ancients look like and act like. This movie showed us what modern vampires do to blend in and pass through the ages. Lestat is brought to life by the music coming from his old house and becomes a rock star unlike any other. He's living in the open. However, now the film shows the pain that he endured in his life, being made a vampire against his will, and then having to learn how to exist after his maker bails because Lestat pulls a big no-no and wakes up a big baddie. Something to mention is they don't have to ask to enter anywhere, which all these modern movie flicks I have noticed so far, it's just something that hasn't shown up yet. Shortly after Queen of the Damned becomes a big film in the vampire genre, the underworld vampire universe takes off in 2003. We get another action-packed vampire film. Now, Celine, the lead, isn't trying to suppress anything this time like Blade did. She's what they call a death dealer, and she's armed with a super sexy pair of auto H&Ks, and she's on a mission to snuff out Lycan, aka werewolves. To me, this is the first time they get this battle right. They stay close to the vampires as aristocratic, and the Lycan are kind of rough and I'll say kind of scummy, but this time they are tough. They are not these little wimpy, pups They really are mean. The twist here is that now we have a love story and a hybrid. And that happens in the movie. This is now a time when the hybrid has the strength and body of a lichen, but is also a vampire and a new look. Now, next in 2007's 30 Days of Night, which gave us some of this kind of the most brutal vampires in modern history. It showed us a small town plunged into an endless polar night and a horde of feral vampires who descend like predators. These vampires aren't suave or seductive. They're hunters, animalistic. Their language is guttural, their teeth are jagged, and their violence is unflinching. This film pulled vampires out of the Gothic castles and into survival mode. No romance here, just primal fear. It reminded audiences that, at their core, vampires are monsters. Just 1 year later, we got the complete other side of the spectrum and everything changed. I have a feeling you guys know where I might be going with this. Enter Twilight. Love it or hate it, the franchise redefined vampires for an entire generation, even if it was wrong, in my opinion. Suddenly, they weren't monsters. They were moody, beautiful immortals with perfect cheekbones and glittery skin. There were bad vampires in there, but they still had this very polished appearance. Instead of stalking prey in the shadows, these vampires attended high school, fell in love with humans, and yes, sparkled in the sun. While horror fans groaned, like myself, Twilight introduced a softer, romanticized vampire, one that spoke to themes of eternal love, self-control, and identity. It made vampires mainstream, not just frightening, but desirable. In 2008, Twilight exploded onto the scene, and suddenly vampires weren't just tragic lovers, they were high school crushes. The Cullen family turned the myth upside down. Vampires who sparkled in the sun, lived on animal blood, and tried to blend into suburban life. Critics mocked it, fans adored it, and either way, it made over $3 billion at the box office, so vampires had gone mainstream for a whole new generation. By 2014, the pendulum swung back towards darkness, but with a twist. Dracula Untold attempted to give us the origin story of the most famous vampire. Instead of a purely evil count, we got a sympathetic prince, Vlad the Impaler, who makes a tragic choice to protect his people. Here, vampirism is both a curse and a sacrifice. The film blends superhero-style action with Gothic lore, trying to humanize Dracula while still keeping him powerful and dangerous. It's part tragedy, part action epic, and it shows how Hollywood was starting to merge horror mythology with blockbuster storytelling. Now, fast forward again to 2024. Now, personally, I feel the vampire genre and story had really gotten, it lost its way. And up until now, I simply could not find a reason to see a vampire film. Then heard about Nosferatu, the remake, right? I not only wanted to see this done in modern day, but I came out of the shadows myself to see it at the theater on my birthday. Now, those who know me, I really don't like going to the theater. There's too many humans and they don't behave. So big deal that I wanted to go. Now, nothing says post-Christmas slump like a grotesque and gorgeous era film, in my opinion. Now, a modern reimagining of the 1922 classic, this version pulls vampires back into that gothic horror. Gone are the sparkles and superhero battles. This is all about atmosphere, shadows, obsession, and again, I use the word grotesque because they really used that when it came to Count Orlok. Like the original Nosferatu, it portrays vampirism as plague and corruption. It's not sexy, it's unsettling. And in an era of sleek CGI monsters, the film's commitment to dread and gothic aesthetic feels like a chilling reminder of why vampires scared us in the first place. They went for it with this one. It's how I would imagine a creature that could not die would look like, to be honest. Maggots and mice, a body riddled with wounds, and a wardrobe that is moth-eaten from the era from which the creature was created. Then, just 6 months later, another film was slated for the cinema, and this one, Mr. Creep and I went on opening day. So, 2 films at the theater. Now this one, The Sinners. The film presents vampires not in castles or fairy tales, but in gritty realism. These aren't aristocrats or supernatural warriors. They're grounded, dirty, and struggling. Now, vampirism becomes a metaphor for addiction, poverty, and cycles of violence. A strange thing to note is that of all the vampire-isms, the writer brings back the oldest rule, that the vampire has to be invited in or it may not enter, which becomes a main turning point in the crescendo of the film. They also introduced this salivation that occurs, reminiscent of a dog drooling when they know that a meal is coming. Is very strange, but it was again another change to the vampire itself. Now, Sinners is a far cry from Twilight's romantic ideals or Dracula Untold's mythic heroism, but instead Sinners roots the vampire myth in today's anxieties, how hunger, depression, and survival can corrupt. So looking at this timeline, everything that we've gone over here, we can see a pattern of kind of what's happening. Now, in the 1920s and the 1930s, vampires are monsters of fear. Vampires as plague, death, and foreign threat. In the 50s and to the 70s, they're monsters of desire. You get a lot of that. There's a lot going on in the real world. So they are gothic, erotic, tied to repressed sexuality and counterculture. In the 80s and the 90s, you get the monsters of cool. They're stylish, tragic, rebellious. They're aligned with youth culture and that existential angst of that time period. Now, the 2000s, right? You get the Blade and the Underworld. These are monsters of action. You get supernatural warriors kind of in blockbuster cinemas back to back. That from 2008 to 2012, this is really kind of the Twilight era, the monsters of fantasy. Twilight turned them into these romantic idols. Now in the 2020s, they're more like monsters of reflection. Nosferatu and Sinners show a split, return to gothic horror and reinvention as gritty metaphor for kind of modern struggles. So where does the vampire go next? The vampire's future seems endless. They can be terrifying, sexy, tragic, hilarious, or even political. They are really a mirror, reflecting the fears and fantasies of each generation that reimagines them. From Nosferatu's plague-bearing shadow to Bela Lugosi's hypnotic stare, and even to Kristen Stewart and Robert Pattinson's eternal prom date, vampires have sunk their fangs deep into cinema history. They've evolved with us, feeding on our anxieties, our desires, and our imaginations. And if history is any guide, they'll keep evolving as long as stories are told in the dark. But thanks for joining me today for this blood-soaked journey through the silver screen with the discussion on the evolution of vampires in film. Now, if you enjoyed today's episode, don't forget to subscribe if you're listening on YouTube. Leave a review on any platform that you may be listening to this audio podcast, and share it with your fellow night creatures, your fellow creeps. We got to get this out to the masses. There's lots of people who enjoy vampires as much as I do. So I want to make sure, share that with your friends. And until next time, watch your neck, creeps. And I'll catch you next time right here on Creepy Confidential.